Okay, we're gonna go short and sweet today. Very, very small lecture, which is no reflection of the importance, I believe, of the Ashcan School. Well, to be honest, I mean, most people don't think about them when they think about 20th century art, but I do. Okay, so the Ashcan School, they also called themselves the Eight. Well, it was a school of painting centered around the teachings of Robert Henri, who preached down-to-earth realism based on the objectivity of the Dutch genre. I don't exactly know what that means. The somber palette of Spanish tonal painting. I get that. And Manet's broad painterliness. Remember, painterliness is when you can see the brushstrokes. To this traditional mixture, Henri added the slashing brushstrokes and vivid highlights of the Munich school. That's from Barbara Rose, one of these giants in American art history, from her book American Painting, which probably came out in the 90s or 80s. Not sure. Okay, so the Ashcan School's leader was Robert Henri. We're going to talk about him in a couple seconds. But he was I want to say that another one of the big influences was Thomas Eakins, who we've talked about before. He's one of the late 19th century artists, along with people like John Singer Sargent and Mary Cassatt, and Henry Osawa Tanner. And right away, I think you can see the influence of Eakins, at least on George Lux. These are both wrestling paintings of wrestlers, which I am familiar with. I was a wrestler in high school for 3 years. My children think that's bizarre. So what's happening here on the left is, I think it's still called a half Nelson. And I don't know my wrestling terminology as much as I used to. And then on the right, I would say, what did we call it back then? He's basically trying to avoid a pen by using his head to get his shoulders off the mat, basically. There's a term for that, but I forgot it, which is probably a good thing. All right, so Thomas Eakins, influential with Robert Henri and others. And here he is. Here's Robert Henri. So a half hour south of my hometown in Nebraska is a town called Cozad. And Robert Henri's father founded the town, and his name was Robert Henri Cozad. And then his father got in a gambling dispute, it turned out horribly. And so they were so embarrassed by this that they moved away from Cozad, and he lopped off his last name, Cozad, and I think it was his middle name was Henri, and he called himself Robert Henri. Now, his brother became a fairly famous surgeon, which is interesting. I mean, wow. Henri is a big name in American art history, and then his brother also did well in the medical field. And this is a portrait of Robert Henri by John Sloan, who was Robert Henri's probably favorite of the group of the Ashcan School painters. Okay, so what is an ashcan? Well, if you've ever had a fireplace in your house, you know that in the morning you take the ashes that are left in the fireplace and you put them in a bucket. And of course, the heating of homes was all about fireplaces. So the idea is that the Robert Henri and the Ashcan School had a dark, gritty palette, okay, and thus called themselves the Ashcan School. A lot of this is happening in New York City, for sure. And on the left, we've got street scene with snow. And I don't know about you guys, but living here in Minnesota for almost 29 years, that whole sort of dirty snow uh, aesthetic is certainly, we're all familiar with it. Although the dirt and grime that we experience is from cars, and in this case, at this point, let's see, the Model T. I don't remember when it's invented, to be honest. Hold on a second. Let's check that out. Okay, I just looked it up. The Model T came out in 1908, so 6 years after Henry's paintings. So I was right. It wouldn't. Well, I mean, it might have come out in 1908, but its popularity and consistent presence on roads, snowy roads, was probably quite a bit later than that. But it's kind of interesting to think about why it's so dirty and grimy. All right, so having said all of what I've sort of outlined as far as the Ashcan School's dark and gritty palette, you also have these really, I think, well, maybe not on the left, but lovely paintings of children. And the way I sort of explain that goes back to the whole idea of, well, he had to make a living with his art, and I would suspect that Henry's paintings of New York City weren't exactly selling like crazy, and so he was commissioned by various different people to do paintings of small children. So I want to go a little bit back to Cozad. I was going across Nebraska. Long story about a car breakdown in Wyoming, and then later I had to go back to Wyoming to get it. But I was in Cozad, and I went to the Robert Henry Museum, and they only had maybe one, if not maybe two, works by him. Because I don't know what his selling price is on the market today, but they don't go for very much. Well, they do go for a lot for a small museum in a relatively small town in Nebraska. So, and there was just this weird experience this woman was talking about, that the loss of life from the gambling accident was not Robert Henry's dad's fault, and I just kind of slowly walked out of the museum. And then, lo and behold, just this summer, Cozad opened up a new Robert Henry Museum, and it looks pretty nice, and I'm wondering what if they've been able to add any actual original works by Robert Henry. That would be good to know. Yeah. All right. Hold on a second. Okay, so I looked it up, and his prices are between $150,000 to $700,000, and his record at auction is $1.5 million in 2009, which, I mean, if you think about it, that's a pretty, I mean, from a billionaire or millionaire collector's point of view, that's pretty reasonable, considering how much various different contemporary artists' works go for. Okay, so next we're looking at a painting of Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, and it's quite interesting. In the early 20th century, a number of women were the founders of major museums in New York City. There's 3 women that founded MoMA, and Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney founded the Whitney Museum of American Art, which now is in its new home. It's incredibly beautiful. Jennifer and I went there. We went there in summer of 2022. It's right along the Hudson. It's right at the end of the High Line, which was a former railroad upper railroad track that's been made into this incredibly beautiful walkway that takes you quite a few miles through New York, the heart of Manhattan. And the Whitney is the most respected American art museum in the United States. Yeah, I would say so. They have a biennial every 2 years. And if they go all around the country looking for the best in art at that moment. So if you get into the Whitney biennial, you're kind of, well, I don't know if the rest of your life is made, but you're doing pretty well. There's a new sort of focus on a Hmong photographer, and I can't remember her name, that was in the show. We actually went to the biennial. I forgot about that in 22. So then that means the newest one is coming out soon. Yeah. So good job, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, in creating that museum. And then every once in a while, I come across these paintings by Henry, and you can kind of, once you sort of see a lot of his portraits, first of all, they're usually full length. And then I think this color palette is pretty recognizable. Obviously, there's going to be some darkness to it at times. I just know that I've been to the Milwaukee Art Museum a number of times, and there was an Ashcan school exhibit there just recently, and I just noticed the how to sort of be able to identify Henry from afar, and that's the sort of thing that I want you guys to be able to do in your life. Hopefully, with all this information that you get from art history, testing yourself by looking at a painting or a sculpture from far away and not being able to look, or not looking at the label and trying to figure out who it is. That's always a great deal of fun. Okay, anything else I want to say about Robert Henry? I don't think so. I don't think there's been a major exhibit just focusing in on him. Certainly there's been one about the Ashcan School for sure. Okay, here he is, John Sloan, the most beloved, probably, it's kind of the teacher's pet, I guess, most beloved of the Ashcan School painters by Henry. And this is actually Henry's portrait of John Sloan. So there we go. And then here we are. So I'm thinking it's Sunset. What does it say? Yeah, that's the title. I'm good at this. I didn't look at the title, and I was able to come up with the title. So this is obviously in Manhattan. And what you're looking at in the middle, at least, is a tenement building that would have been occupied by a number of people. Remember, this is the time of the great immigration from Europe to the United States. I think we can safely say we're still in it in 1906. Most of my poor European immigrant DNA came a little bit earlier than that, maybe like the 1880s, 90s. I took a course on urban history between my freshman and sophomore year in college, and it was a junior level course taught by Professor Perlman, and I just loved it. I didn't know anything about the topic, really, being from a very rural area, and so the actual tenements were very crowded, and not the best living situation, but so it's kind of interesting that he would be on the rooftops painting this scene. All right, here's some more. Um, this is Hairdresser's Window, which to me, I always think it's kind of odd. I mean, did people actually stand outside and look into a hairdresser's window? Maybe. Well, I guess Sloan saw it. I mean, he's painting the reality of his world in front of him. And then on the right is 6 o'clock. It's the subway. You guys may know that I spent a month at Columbia University back in the summer of 2000 and rode the New York City's subways quite a bit. It is an experience for sure. One that somebody should do at least once in their lives, or the subway system in Chicago or somewhere else as well. So crowded conditions in this time period in the early 20th century. And then movies. 5 cents. I wonder how much that would have really been in comparison to today. 5 cents was probably a good deal of money? Probably not, but I mean, well, you never know. What can we sort of compare movies to in this time period? I think probably the beginnings of the internet would be the best. I still remember the first time I saw a hyperlink and clicked on it. I really do. I remember that, and I thought it was magic. I just remember teaching without the internet back in the 90s and how difficult that was, and being able to use the internet was just amazing. And they must have bowled them over when they watched their first movie. I mean, there's that very famous story that when people watched a train on the movie screen, they sort of shirked and thought the train was actually coming into the movie theater. So, yeah, what interesting new world movies brought to people. Okay, and then this is actually, believe it or not, at the Walker Arts Center, and it's not Ashcan aesthetic necessarily. I guess their swimming suits are dark, but it gives you a sense of leisure time back in this time period. It also gives you a sense of swimming suits, which with this woman is I don't know how she would do it, swimming in basically a dress and hosiery. But the reason why I like this is it's just, a cheap way to vacation and be under the sun, and that whole sort of leisure weekend was invented in the 19th century, but certainly developed more in the 20th century. Okay, so on the left is 3 a.m. We think that the woman to the left is a sex worker and has just come in at 3 a.m. and her girlfriend is making some breakfast for her, or I guess a 3 a.m. breakfast for her. And then Night Windows is on the right. So when I first moved to Washington, D.C. in the spring of 1992, I was in an apartment building probably that had about 4 floors, maybe 5 floors. And then the apartment next to us was really large with a lot of floors. And that was my first real experience with vertical living. My family's house was a ranch sort of style house. I guess we had one level, but you guys will probably at some point live in well, some of you already do, obviously, but live in a high rise, or have a high rise near where you're living. I really like this one, and I'm not alone. There's a lot of people who love this one. So there was life in New York City on the roofs, and again back to the sun a little bit. Heck, it's called Sunday girls drying their hair, or I guess it's Sunday girl drying her hair. Yeah, so you can imagine Sloane. I would suspect that he did preliminary drawings for his paintings, and so he was probably up. You wonder if he was paying them for being models, or I would have to believe he did, or maybe it was friends. Who knows? And then this one to the left, I'm not sure that you would classify. I mean, if this was the first one that you saw by Sloane, I don't necessarily know if you would call him an Ashcan school painter with all the flowers and their colors and everything. Although the rainy, dark day is probably okay there. And then the last one by Sloane is Chinese Restaurant, with a really cute cat there on the right. All right, now we're going to turn to somebody that's not as well known, not necessarily celebrated as much as Sloane and Henry, and that's William Glackens. And this is along the Hudson, I would have to believe. And I forgot to talk about the fact that Sloane, Glackens, they were newspaper illustrators. They were commercial artists. And, that was a viable career for an artist in that time period. So, and I don't know what the balance was, how much commercial art were they doing at the same time that they were doing these major fine art paintings. But yeah, so you should know that the background of a lot of these artists is the whole idea of making a living by illustrating stories in newspapers. I think it's pretty easy to say that this is highly influenced by the Impressionists. I would specifically say probably Monet, maybe a slight bit of Degas there. And yeah, so Impressionism, it goes without saying that the modern movements do seep into some of the American artists. In fact, they're the ones that created the what's called the Armory Show to bring modernism to America. So yeah, you're definitely seeing an Impressionist influence here. Okay, this is George Lux, and the portrait of him is on the left, Robert Henry's portrait of George Lux, 1904. And then it's called The Spielers to the right. Okay, Hester Street. So we're back at ground level. Perfect. Ashcan, check mark. Although there is a little bit of color. There's a little bit of blue for sure. What else? Yeah, just crowded conditions. It kind of reminds me of our time in Italy, and just at night especially, going to these, especially in Rome, the flower shops, or not flower shops, flower sellers in the piazzas, and at night seeing all of the cleanup, the incredible cleanup of these squares. It was fascinating to live in that world, because as Americans, we're separated out, right? Especially in the suburbs. You have your yard, you have your distance between houses, and that's not true for some European living, at least. Okay, this is Blue Devils Fifth Avenue, and I think it's a commentary on World War I. These would have been marching French soldiers, and I would suspect that Lux was a pacifist, didn't want the United States to get involved in World War I. Okay, the outlier of all the Ashcan School painters is Maurice Prendergast. And I've never really understood, and maybe I should sit down and sort of study this a little bit more. I never really understood why he's a part of the Ashcan School, because his works are very colorful and very painterly and very influenced by Impressionism. And so, yeah, it's just, he's a great mystery to me. Yeah, so that's Prendergast. And then here's Everett Shin. It's called The Orchestra Pit. And again, I would have to believe that he was influenced a little bit by especially Degas, no doubt about it, in this work. And we didn't really talk about this when we looked at the movie genre scene earlier, but of course, what killed off a lot of stage performances, the cabaret, so on and so forth, was the movie industry. And that before that time, people, if they were going to be entertained, whether it's opera or dance, they were used to going and seeing it live. The same thing for recorded music, right? That changes the whole ball game with regards to entertainment. So yeah, anyways, it's kind of interesting to think about. Okay, last but not least, it's George Bellows. I think he's pretty beloved and pretty well known. I would rank him maybe third, well, maybe even second, next to Robert Henry. And this is 42 Kids. Just for me in my little small town, we would go to the pool, the public pool, from 10 to 4 every day. I mean, my mom would go to work, my dad would go to work, and they knew where we were. They knew we were safe, and yeah, swimming is a good thing. And then he really does a nice job with his blue palette, I think. It's almost a little bit startling. And this is called Blue Morning. I think he introduces a little bit more color than the average the 8 or Ashcan School painter. And then this one, I really love this one. I've been across bridges going into Manhattan a couple of times at least, and just the beautiful blue of the river is quite nice. Yeah. And then let's go to his most famous stuff. On the left, Stag at Sharky's. So boxing is a sport in this time period that's very popular, and I think there's some commentary by, and I just don't think, I know there's commentary by Bellows, excuse me, but because the people in the audience are really ghoulish, and it's just such a violent sport that maybe in your lifetime will be banned. I don't know. It's not easy to look at. And then what's interesting is that 17 years later, he does another boxing scene, and it's called Dempsey and Firpo. And boy, it's changed so much. The painting is much more realistic. There's no longer that sort of scary audience, and it's labeled Dempsey and Firpo, so it's an actual historical fight, which I think is interesting, just the contrast between these two. And then you've got New York City, 1911. I just love the different little vignettes that are going on in this painting, and the horses, up against the skyline. It's an impressive piece. And then the last one is probably his second most famous painting. It's Cliff Dwellers. He had just gone to New Mexico and had seen the cliff dwellings there, and then he's associating cliff dwelling with apartment living, urban living, vertical living in New York City. Okay, that's it.